The night had been unforgivingly quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that makes you wonder if you're alone or just incredibly lonely. I was delivering a pizza standard work for a Friday night when the warning lights on my dashboard began flickering like eerie beacons. The car sputtered, then choked and died, leaving me stranded on an isolated road where the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the dark sky. I'd called my manager and my brother as soon as the car came to a shuddering halt, their voices a distant comfort on my cell phone. My manager promised to sort things out with the customer, while my brother, ever the stalwart hero, assured me he'd be on his way with a tow truck. But as I waited, the loneliness of the situation began to gnaw at me. The night was so still, it seemed almost to be holding its breath. That's when I saw him, a figure emerging from the darkness, his silhouette jagged against the faint light of the moon. At first, he looked like nothing more than a shadow, but as he drew nearer, the harshness of his presence became clear. His clothes were rumpled, his face obscured beneath a battered cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved with a deliberate, almost predatory gait, his footsteps crunching on the gravel with a rhythm that seemed unnervingly intentional. I could feel the air grow colder, the oppressive weight of the night pressing in on me. I locked the car doors instinctively, though I knew it was too late to avoid a confrontation. He reached the window and knocked sharply, his fist striking the glass with a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. I rolled down the window a crack, trying to gauge his intentions, but his eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to scrape against my nerves. I shook my head, my throat dry and uncooperative. "I'm waiting for a tow truck," I managed to stammer. His eyes, now visible as he leaned closer, were a chilling blue that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "I don't have time for that," he snapped, his voice rising in an edge of frustration. "It's late, and I need to get somewhere fast." I could sense the danger in his posture, the way he moved as though he was calculating his next move. The air inside the car felt suddenly too thick, too heavy with the scent of fear. I glanced around, searching for any sign of my brother or the tow truck, but the road was as empty as it had been moments before. The man's demeanor shifted from demanding to threatening. His hand reached into his coat pocket, and I saw the glint of a blade as he pulled out a knife. My breath hitched in my chest, the image of that cold steel against the night making my heart pound erratically. "You've got one chance," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me in, or things are going to get ugly." I kept my eyes fixed on the knife, trying to ignore the trembling in my hands. My mind raced, searching for any way out of this nightmare. The man pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he tried to peer inside. His knife tapped against the lock, a rhythmic, cruel reminder of the danger I was in. I could hear the distant rumble of an engine, my brother's truck. The sound was a lifeline, but it also brought a fresh wave of terror. The man's expression darkened as he heard it too, and he redoubled his efforts, wrenching at the door handle and scratching at the lock with a frantic energy that bordered on frenzy. The seconds stretched out, each one an eternity, as I desperately tried to keep the door secure. The knife scratched against the metal with an awful screech, a sound that made my skin crawl. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the cold panic that had gripped me. Just as I thought the car would give way, I saw the headlights of the tow truck cut through the darkness. My brother's voice rang out, a beacon of relief, as he shouted at the man, his presence a sudden and fortuitous interruption. The stranger spun around, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He threw one last, resentful glance at me before he melted back into the shadows, his form disappearing into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. My brother reached the car and yanked open the door, his face a mixture of concern and fury. He pulled me into a tight hug, his relief palpable as he made sure I was unharmed. The tow truck's lights flickered against the night, chasing away the lingering shadows of the encounter. Later, when the police arrived and took my statement, I tried to calm my racing heart. They promised to patrol the area, but I knew the darkness held secrets that weren't easily uncovered. As I drove away with my brother, the night seemed to close in around us, a reminder of the horrors that lurked just out of sight, waiting to strike when least expected. The car broke down on that forsaken road, but the real terror was in the realization that sometimes the darkness conceals more than just the absence of light. It hides the monsters that walk among us, waiting for their moment to pounce. The hour was past midnight, when the streets had long surrendered to darkness, and even the streetlights seemed to blink in weary resignation. I had just picked up a grocery order from the 24-hour gas station, a quick errand in what was supposed to be a straightforward night. But as I pulled out of the station, something was different, an unsettling sense of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It was late, and the mind tends to conjure shadows from the mundane. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed a pair of headlights trailing me at a distance. Nothing extraordinary, just a car, but the feeling of being followed gnawed at me. I decided to ignore it, hoping my unease would fade with the miles. Then, without warning, the car jolted with a violent thud. I pulled over, the suddenness of it striking me like a punch in the gut. I got out, my breath visible in the cold air, and saw the flat tire. It wasn't just flat, it was gashed, as if someone had deliberately sliced it. My pulse quickened. The car that had been tailing me had stopped behind me, its headlights slicing through the night like a spotlight on a stage. A man emerged from the vehicle, a scruffy figure, clad in a trench coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. He approached with an unsteady gait, his eyes darting around with a nervous energy that set off every alarm in my head. He offered to help with the tire, but his voice was jittery, like the tremors of an old record. "Need a hand there?" he asked, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I tried to keep calm, forcing a smile that I hoped looked reassuring. "No, I've got it covered. Thanks anyway." His smile widened unnervingly. "Are you sure? It's a real mess. I'd hate to see you stranded out here." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. The darkness around us seemed to close in, as if the night itself were leaning in to eavesdrop. I made a decision on instinct. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on him. "I'm good. Really." The man's expression shifted, and the unsettling smile vanished, replaced by something darker and impatient frustration. As I fumbled to call for help, I heard him mumble something about the job and how it had to be done. My heart raced, a chaotic drumbeat against my ribs. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I bolted towards the woods that bordered the roadside. The crunch of leaves underfoot was a sharp contrast to the otherwise still night. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence behind me, an oppressive shadow that seemed to grow with every step I took. The trees swallowed me whole, their branches clawing at my clothes as I ran deeper into the forest. I could hear the man's voice behind me, angry and distant, fading into the night as I put more distance between us. The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the menace lurking behind me. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit ceased. I waited in the cold embrace of the woods, trembling from both fear and the chill. When I finally ventured back to the roadside, the man's car was gone. The flat tire still lay in its damaged state, a grim reminder of the encounter. I contacted the police, reporting the incident with a shaky voice. The investigation turned up little. The man's details were genuine, but his criminal record was unremarkable: a petty thief who had stolen from the car but left no lasting harm. The police assured me that it was a botched attempt at theft rather than anything more sinister. Still, the encounter left me with a deep sense of unease. The incident had felt like a setup, an unnerving game with rules I didn't understand. The simple errand had turned into a nightmarish chase, leaving me with more questions than answers. I never did figure out the connection to the Uber Eats order, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something far more terrifying. The encounter with the man in the trench coat remained a haunting reminder that sometimes the night holds more than just darkness. It holds threats that slither in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. The carnival was a ghost town by the time I got there. The once bright lights now flickered like tired eyes, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. Most of the rides had already shut down, their metal skeletons gleaming eerily under the dim street lights. The place had that familiar, unsettling quiet of a world that had just missed the end of a long day. I had come for a bit of mindless entertainment and escape from the relentless grind of everyday life. What I got instead was something that would haunt my every waking moment. The fun house stood alone, its colorful facade peeling like old paint on a forgotten house. The entrance was unremarkable, save for the faint sound of carnival music playing inside, twisted and distorted as though someone had cranked the volume to drown out the screams of the damned. I stepped inside, and the world shifted into a carnival of nightmares. The first thing that struck me was the stifling air, thick with a mixture of stale popcorn and the sharp, acrid scent of something I couldn't quite place. The mirrors were the real draw here, giant, wavy slabs of glass that distorted reality into grotesque shapes and eerie reflections. They stood in chaotic rows, bending light and perception into something nightmarish. I could see my reflection, but it looked wrong, like an actor in a bad movie, playing a part poorly. It wasn't long before I noticed something even more disturbing. A figure slipping between the mirrors. At first I thought it was just another trick of the glass, a distorted shape that would vanish when I turned my head. But it didn't. It was a man, or rather, a grotesque parody of one. His face was twisted into a deranged smile, the kind you see in old horror movies when the villain's just about to reveal his true nature. His eyes were dark holes, hollow and depthless, as if he'd seen something too terrible to describe. I caught glimpses of him here and there, always just out of clear sight. He seemed to be following me, moving with an unnatural grace through the maze of mirrors. The carnival music played on, a twisted melody that only made the experience more surreal. The more I tried to ignore him, the more his presence became impossible to escape. He was in every reflection, every warped image, always just behind me, his smile growing wider with every step I took. A wave of unease swept over me. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the laughter started, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It echoed through the mirrors, bouncing off the walls and growing louder, more manic. It wasn't just the figure's laughter, it was a chorus of whispers, of voices that seemed to be rising from the shadows, drawing me into a pit of despair. Suddenly, I turned a corner and there he was, standing right in front of me. The deranged smile was even more pronounced up close, his eyes like two voids staring right into my soul. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I tried to run, but the mirrors seemed to close in on me, distorting my path and trapping me in a maze with no exit. The figure reached out, and before I could react, his cold, clammy hand gripped my arm with a vice-like force. His touch was ice cold, sending a shiver up my spine. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unnaturally strong. He leaned in, his breath cold and foul against my ear as he whispered, "You can't escape. You're part of the show now." Panic surged through me. I kicked and thrashed, but it was as if the very walls of the funhouse had come alive, closing in around me. I fought back with everything I had, desperate to break free from his grip. In a final burst of adrenaline, I managed to wrench myself away and stumbled into a dead-end corner, the laughter growing louder, more frenzied. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figure was gone, the mirrors now reflecting only my terrified, disheveled face. The laughter was replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I fled the funhouse, running out into the night air, which was as cold and unwelcoming as the figure's touch. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the carnival. I looked back, but the funhouse was dark and empty, its twisted facade now just a looming shadow in the distance. I never went back, but the image of that deranged smile, the sound of that haunting laughter, still follows me. Every now and then, when the night is quiet and the mirrors reflect the shadows of my own fears, I can still feel his cold grip, hear his whispered threat. The carnival is gone now, replaced by a new development. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear that distorted carnival music playing, the echoes of laughter reverberating through my dreams. I know I'll never forget the funhouse or the nightmare that lurked within its mirrors. And as I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, I can't help but wonder, is there something still watching me from behind those reflections, waiting for the right moment to strike again? It was a night like any other for a DoorDash delivery driver. The air was crisp with a hint of autumn, the kind of night where shadows played tricks and every creak of the car was magnified by the quiet streets. I was just finishing up my last delivery, the clock ticking past 10, when the address for the final drop-off appeared on my phone, 17 Maple Street. It wasn't on my usual route, but it was a job, and the pay was decent. The house at 17 Maple Street was one of those old, decrepit places that seemed to sigh with the wind. It loomed out of the darkness like something out of a forgotten dream, its sagging roof and peeling paint giving it an air of neglect that set my nerves on edge. As I approached, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the blackness. The noise emanating from inside was strange, an incoherent mix of moaning and muffled voices that seemed to come from the very walls. I parked my car and approached the door, trying to ignore the unsettling noise that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Delivery for Chris." The door creaked open a little more, and a man emerged from the shadows. His face was gaunt, eyes wild as if he'd been driven mad by some unseen force. His clothes were disheveled, stained in a way that suggested more than just dirt. He seemed to be in a state of panic, a desperation that made my skin crawl. "Bring it inside," he said, his voice trembling and urgent. I hesitated. There was something about him, an edge of danger that set off every alarm in my head. "I can just leave it here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't need to." No, his voice was sharp, almost frantic. "It's important. Please just come in. I need to talk to you." I glanced inside, catching a glimpse of chaos, overturned furniture, scattered papers, and the source of the noise, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the house. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something about the man's plea kept me rooted in place. "Look, I really don't think I should." Before I could finish, the man stepped forward, grabbing the bag of food with a grip that was far too tight. His eyes locked onto mine with a kind of intensity that made me shiver. Now he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Every fiber of my being told me to run, but I took a deep breath and stepped inside, trying to ignore the creeping dread that settled in my chest. The interior was worse than I had imagined. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and something metallic that made my stomach churn. The man led me through a cluttered living room and down a narrow hallway, the noise growing louder, more insistent. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but my nerves were frayed. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pushed open a door at the end of the hallway and gestured for me to enter. I hesitated on the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. The noise was deafening now, a cacophony of muffled screams and shuffling footsteps. "I'm sorry, I really need to get going," I said, my voice barely audible over the chaos. The man's face twisted in anger. "You don't understand. They're coming for me. You have to help." His desperation was palpable, but it was the kind of desperation that made me want to back away slowly. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, a cold, paralyzing fear that I couldn't ignore. I took a step back, but he blocked my path, his eyes wide and frantic. "I have to go," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm leaving now." The man's face turned an ugly shade of rage. "You can't leave. Not until you see what's inside." I shoved past him, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled down the hallway. The noise behind me grew louder, a terrifying chorus of wails and groans that seemed to follow me. I burst through the front door and ran to my car, throwing the food bag into the passenger seat and starting the engine with shaking hands. As I sped away from the house, my mind raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening inside that house, something that was far beyond my understanding. I called the police, my voice trembling as I described the scene. They assured me they would send someone over, but I knew better. Later, when the police arrived, they found the house empty. The man was gone, and there was no sign of any disturbance. They spoke to the neighbors, who all said they hadn't heard anything unusual. The police closed the case, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen, and the noise that still echoed in my mind. It was a sound that never quite left me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most ordinary facades. And every time I drive past 17 Maple Street, I can't help but wonder what horrors still lie behind that half-open door. I used to love carnivals. There was something magical about them, the bright lights slicing through the night, the sweet smell of cotton candy mingling with the sharp tang of popcorn. They were a haven of innocence, a place where dreams seemed just a little closer to reality. Or so I thought. The change came slowly, like the creep of fog over a quiet town, and it all began on that fateful night at the carnival. I remember it vividly, as if it were etched into the very fabric of my memory. My friends and I had wandered into the grounds, hearts light with anticipation, but from the moment we set foot on the cracked asphalt, something felt off. We brushed it off at first. The carnival was unusually empty, almost deserted, really. The usual clamor of children's laughter and the garish calls of vendors were replaced by an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the Ferris wheel. It was as though the carnival had been abandoned in haste, left to molder in the darkness. I pushed the unease aside, forcing a smile as we approached the first ride. The neon lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. The air, once filled with joyous sounds, was now eerily still. My friends joked about the place being haunted, but I wasn't laughing. A creeping sensation had settled in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing awareness that something was wrong. It wasn't long before things started to unravel. As we approached the funhouse, its mirrored facade warped in a way that made it look like a grotesque carnival of horrors. The entrance was flanked by a pair of rusted clown statues, their grinning faces frozen in an eternal, unsettling leer. I felt a shiver trace my spine, but I pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and misplaced bravado. Inside, the funhouse was a maze of distorted reflections and flickering lights. We wandered through the disorienting corridors, our laughter echoing hollowly. It was all fun and games until we stumbled upon an old ticket booth at the heart of the maze. A threadbare curtain, stained with something dark and old, hung beside it, Curiosity got the better of us, and we peeked inside. There, behind the counter, was an old scrapbook, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The scrapbook was filled with clippings, pictures of carnivals from decades past. But what made my blood run cold were the photos of people. They weren't just any people. They were people who had been reported missing. Their faces were frozen in moments of joy, moments that now seemed disturbingly out of place. I remember feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I flipped through the pages. The dates were recent, too recent for comfort. My friends noticed my growing agitation, but when I showed them the scrapbook, they laughed it off, attributing it to a sick joke or a piece of twisted carnival lore. But I wasn't convinced. The unsettling sensation had transformed into a heavy dread. Our night took a darker turn when we decided to leave. As we walked back to the main grounds, I noticed the carnival had changed. The vibrant lights had dimmed, replaced by flickering bulbs that cast long, shuddering shadows. The once friendly clowns and game booths now seemed menacing, their painted smiles warped into sinister grins. The real horror hit when we saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, moving in the periphery of our vision. They were blurred, indistinct shapes, but their presence was palpable. I felt a chill run through me as they seemed to follow us, their intentions unreadable but undeniably malevolent. I tried to convince myself it was just our imagination playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. We hurried back to our car, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. The atmosphere was suffocating, each step toward the exit feeling like a step away from safety. The carnival, once a symbol of joy and wonder, had become a twisted nightmare, a playground of shadows and fear. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia that had taken root in me. The carnival's bright lights and cheerful facade had been nothing but a veneer, masking something far more sinister. The scrapbook, the eerie figures, and the oppressive atmosphere had left me with a gnawing sense of unease. Now, every time I see a carnival, I am reminded of that night. The bright lights and cheerful music only serve to mask the lingering shadows, the secrets hidden beneath the surface. What was once a symbol of joy has become a harbinger of dread. The carnival, with all its twisted delights, has left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most innocent pleasures, darkness can lurk, waiting for the moment to reveal its true face. I've learned to view carnivals with skepticism now. The fear they evoke is a constant reminder of the shadows that linger just out of sight, the darkness that can transform a place of laughter into a theater of terror. The carnival of my childhood is gone, replaced by a haunted memory of shadows and whispers, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred into something inescapably sinister. The house on Larkspur Lane. I'd never liked the idea of working late shifts, especially not in that part of town. But when you're 16 and desperate for a few extra bucks, you take what you can get. So there I was, navigating the back roads and potholes, delivering pizza to places that even the night seemed to avoid. The streets grew narrower as I approached Larkspur Lane, a name that always seemed to mock the place's dismal state. The house loomed in front of me like an abandoned dollhouse, its paint peeling and windows fogged with a fog that never quite lifted. A creeping dread snaked through me as I parked the car, the engine's hum abruptly silenced. I grabbed the pizza box, feeling its warmth seep into my palms as if trying to offer some comfort. The door creaked open before I could knock, and a young woman stood there, her eyes too wide, almost too bright for the dim light spilling from inside. Her dress hung loose, fraying at the edges like she had walked out of a time long forgotten. "Thank you," she said, her voice tremulous but polite. I noticed the way her gaze darted to the shadows behind her, as if expecting something or someone. "No problem," I replied, handing her the pizza. I didn't wait for any more awkward small talk. I turned on my heel, eager to leave. Just as I reached the edge of the porch, the front door slammed shut behind me. My heart dropped as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from inside the house. My instinct screamed at me to move, but I was frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. That's when I saw them. Two men, both taller than me, emerging from the darkness of the house. Their faces were hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, and their movements were unnervingly synchronized, like puppets on invisible strings. Panic surged through me. I didn't know if they had seen me or if they were just leaving, but my gut told me that standing still was not an option. I sprinted down the steps, nearly tripping over my own feet as I darted toward the overgrown hedges that flanked the driveway. The thick vegetation clawed at my clothes, pulling me back like some malevolent hand. I could hear the men's voices now, muffled but urgent, and the scrape of their shoes on the gravel as they followed. I burst through the tangled brush, branches slapping against my face, the pizza box slapping my side with each desperate step. My car came into view, parked under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. The sight of it was a beacon of hope, a promise of escape. As I fumbled with my keys, my mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. Who were those men? What did they want? Why had the woman acted so strangely? The car door finally clicked open and I dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine, the car's roar a thunderous affirmation of my escape. I didn't look back as I sped away, leaving Larkspur Lane and its secrets far behind me. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and shadowy trees, my thoughts swirling with the unsettling encounter. The next morning, I told my boss about the incident. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination. But when I reported it to the police, their response was even more disconcerting. They couldn't find any trace of the men, and the house on Larkspur Lane had been empty for months, no sign of recent inhabitants, no woman, no suspicious activity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark lingered in that house, something that neither the police nor I could fully understand. And as I drive past that street now, I can't help but glance nervously at the shadows, half expecting to see those two men waiting for me, or worse, something even more sinister. The house on Larkspur Lane remains as it was that night, a crumbling relic of the past, harboring secrets best left undisturbed. But sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear those same heavy footsteps trailing behind me in the dark, a reminder that some things are better left unexamined. The carnival had always been a place of innocent thrills, a patchwork of neon lights and screeching rides, promising a few hours of escape from the mundane. I had gone with my friends that summer evening, drawn by the allure of cheap thrills and cotton candy, but that night, the carnival turned into a labyrinth of dread. It all began with the fun house. From the outside, it looked like any other attraction, an old building with chipped paint and gaudy, flickering lights that tried too hard to mask the decay beneath. Its name, the Enchanted Maze, promised playful disorientation and laughter, but as we stepped inside, a shiver of unease skittered down my spine. The interior was a maze of mirrors and corridors, each twist and turn more disorienting than the last. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of our vision. It was supposed to be fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We laughed nervously as we navigated through the mirror maze, but the laughter quickly turned into uneasy murmurs as we noticed something odd. In one of the darker corners, hidden behind a mirror that looked just a little too old, we found a door. It was small and unassuming, almost like an afterthought in the design of the fun house. Curiosity got the better of us. We nudged it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness below. My heart pounded as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, dusty crates and the remnants of forgotten carnival paraphernalia. But it was the smell that really hit us, a musty, metallic stench that hinted at decay and something more sinister. A faded sign on one wall caught my eye: Prohibition-era safe house, restricted access. The words seemed out of place in a fun house meant to entertain, and as I read them, a chill ran through me. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my own apprehension. The room was filled with a mix of old documents, rusted tools, and a few ancient bottles that looked like they had been pulled from a bygone era. As we rummaged through the debris, we found blueprints of the carnival grounds, blueprints that included a series of underground tunnels branching out from the funhouse. Our unease grew as we realized that these tunnels dated back to the Prohibition era. The carnival owner had always seemed like a somewhat mysterious figure, someone who kept his distance from the revelers. The discovery raised troubling questions. Had he been aware of the hidden history of his attraction? Were there more secrets buried within these walls? As we pored over the documents, we began to piece together a chilling narrative. The funhouse had once served as a clandestine meeting point for bootleggers and organized crime during the Prohibition. The tunnels were used for smuggling illegal alcohol, a hidden network meant to evade the authorities. The idea of this dark past lurking beneath the carnival's cheerful facade was disturbing, but what really unsettled us was the possibility of what might still be hidden in those tunnels. Our sense of dread deepened when we found a small, locked chest buried under a pile of debris. The chest was old and heavy, bound with iron and covered in grime. We pried it open, and inside, we found a collection of items that made our skin crawl: old photographs of people with faces obscured, faded documents that hinted at dark dealings, and a small, leather-bound journal filled with disturbing notes and cryptic symbols. One note in particular stood out, a warning scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Beware the shadows. They are always watching." Our discovery had taken a turn from intriguing to horrifying. The carnival, which had seemed so innocent just hours before, was now a place of hidden menace. The shadowy figures of the past seemed to loom over us, their presence palpable even in the absence of tangible threats. We decided to leave the fun house immediately, the air of malevolence thick around us as we climbed the stairs back to the carnival's surface. The lively sounds of laughter and music seemed jarring in contrast to the darkness we had uncovered. As we exited, the carnival owner's gaze seemed to follow us, his eyes cold and knowing, as if he was aware of the secrets we had stumbled upon. We left the carnival that night with a sense of unease that wouldn't leave us for days. The fun house, once a source of amusement, had revealed itself as a gateway to a hidden past filled with shadows and secrets. The carnival's facade of joy and laughter had cracked, revealing a dark and unsettling truth beneath. The next time I see a carnival, I will remember that night, the discovery of hidden tunnels, and the eerie echoes of a bygone era. And though the carnival may continue to spin its bright lights and cheerful tunes, I will always see the shadows lurking just out of sight, waiting to remind me of the secrets buried beneath the surface. The side road was as forgotten as it was forsaken, snaking through the darkness like a scar that hadn't healed. The headlights of my delivery truck cut through the mist, a feeble attempt to push back the night. I was alone, save for the truck's steady hum and noise that promised stability, a guarantee that everything would turn out just fine. Or so I thought. As the fog thickened, it felt like the air itself was swallowing my truck whole. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally, with a resentful wheeze, gave up altogether. The dashboard lights flickered out, leaving me bathed in a dim, ghostly green glow. Silence enveloped me, thick and oppressive. I was marooned, a shipwrecked sailor on a foggy sea of asphalt. My heart began to race as I fumbled for my phone. The little screen illuminated my face with an eerie light as I dialed my friend Tom. "Hey, I'm stuck," I said, my voice barely disguising the edge of panic. "No idea what's wrong." Can you come out here?" "Sure thing," Tom replied, his voice steady. "I'll be there as soon as I can." I sat there, shivering slightly, feeling the creeping chill of the fog invade my bones. The stillness was oppressive, like being wrapped in a cold, wet blanket. The only sound was the occasional drip of condensation from the trees. And then, from the depths of the fog, I saw a shadow moving with purpose. At first, it was just a smear, but it grew more distinct as it approached. A figure, indistinct and shrouded in the mist, loomed closer. I squinted, my breath fogging up the window. I could barely make out the shape, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my phone and dialed Tom again, but before the call connected, I saw the figure moving towards my truck, its steps slow and deliberate. I could see now that it was a man, his face obscured by the fog and the dim light. He approached my truck, his movements unsettlingly calm. He peered through the window, his eyes hollow and unreadable. I watched in growing horror as he tried the door handle. It rattled with a metallic clink, but it was locked. He stepped back, seeming to size up the truck, as if it were a puzzle to be solved. I clutched my phone, my knuckles white. I tried to shout, but no sound emerged. Panic had rendered me mute. The man then reached into his coat, pulling out something, a dark, sinister object that glinted menacingly in the foggy light. I couldn't see it clearly, but my gut told me it was something dangerous. He crouched beside the truck, trying to hide it from view, his movements hurried and furtive. I felt a surge of relief as I spotted headlights piercing the fog. Tom was finally here. I flung open the truck door, stumbling out with my heart in my throat. Tom's truck skidded to a halt, and he leaped out, scanning the area with a mix of concern and disbelief. "What's going on?" Tom asked, his voice edged with alarm. "That guy," I managed to croak, pointing toward the man who had now stood up, his eyes locking onto Tom's vehicle. He began to move away, melting back into the fog, like a specter retreating from the light. Tom moved with purpose, heading toward the truck. "Stay here," he instructed, as he approached the area where the man had been. I watched, my anxiety mounting, as Tom inspected my truck. It was then that I noticed the broken lock and the scattered contents of the cab. Someone had rifled through my things, tossing papers and personal items about with careless disregard. The man's intentions were now clear. He had been after something, anything of value. Tom returned, shaking his head. "The truck's been broken into. Nothing's missing that I can see," but he glanced at me, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. Fast." As we drove away, I glanced back at the road, the fog closing in behind us like a hungry maw. The man was gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, whispering secrets I would never understand. The cold and the fear clung to me like a second skin. I kept replaying the night's events, each detail magnified in the dark corners of my mind. The man, the broken truck, the stolen moments of safety, all became threads in a tapestry of dread. And as we left the fog behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, something that thrived in the mist and shadow, waiting for the next unwary traveler to cross its path. The summer I turned 16, I took a part-time job delivering pizzas for Pizza Hut. I wanted some extra cash for gas and the occasional movie ticket, and the job seemed like an easy way to earn it. Most of the time, the job was uneventful, just your standard routine of delivering hot, greasy food to cranky customers. But then, there was that one delivery that twisted everything into a nightmare. It started like any other evening. I was working the late shift, zipping through the streets of our sleepy little town, my mind wandering to whatever high school drama was brewing. The phone rang at the store, and my manager handed me a slip of paper with an address I'd never heard of before, a neighborhood that hadn't been on my delivery route before. The address was on the outskirts of town, near an old park that had long since fallen into disrepair. I glanced at the address again, a sense of unease settling over me. It was late, and the park was a desolate place even during the day. But I shrugged it off. It was just a delivery. What could go wrong? When I pulled up to the park, the world seemed eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long, jittery shadows that danced across the pavement. I parked my car and grabbed the pizza bag, hoping the tip would be worth the unsettling atmosphere. I walked through the park, each step making the gravel crunch beneath my sneakers. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. My footsteps echoed louder than I expected, creating an almost surreal soundtrack to my trepidation. I saw the man before he saw me. He was sitting alone on a weathered bench, his back hunched as he muttered to himself. The bench was half hidden in the shadows, and the man's face was obscured by the brim of a hat pulled low over his eyes. I couldn't make out his features, but his body language was enough to make my skin crawl. He was jittery, glancing around as though expecting someone or something to appear. As I approached, I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. "Delivery for Mr. Thompson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man looked up, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and he had the pallor of someone who hadn't seen daylight in days. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, his voice trembling. He reached into his pocket and fumbled for cash, but his hand kept shaking. It wasn't the oddest thing I'd ever seen, but it was definitely unsettling. I handed him the pizza, trying to ignore the creeping anxiety. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a rustling from the direction of the trees. My heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged from the darkness, a man in a black mask and hood, brandishing a knife. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to process what was happening. The masked man's eyes glinted with malevolent intent as he lunged at me. I barely had time to react before he grabbed me by the collar, dragging me towards the woods. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the eerie silence of the park. Desperation surged through me as I struggled against his grip, but his strength was overpowering. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard a loud commotion behind us. The masked man paused, turning his attention to the source of the noise. It was the man on the bench. He was now scrambling to his feet and running in the opposite direction, his previous nervousness replaced by a frantic energy. "Help! Somebody help!" he screamed, but his cries were swallowed by the darkness. The masked man hesitated for a moment, then released me and gave chase, disappearing into the woods after the fleeing man. I wasted no time. Trembling with fear, I bolted towards my car, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, fumbling with the keys and nearly dropping them in my panic. I sped away from the park, not daring to look back. When I reached the police station, my hands were still shaking as I recounted the nightmarish events. The officers were sympathetic but skeptical, taking my statement with a mix of concern and disbelief. They promised to send a team to investigate, but when they searched the park and the surrounding woods, they found no trace of either the masked man or the other victim. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. The way the man on the bench vanished into the night and the masked figure's menacing presence haunt my dreams. The pizza delivery job went on, but I never received another order to that park again. I wonder if the man I saw was simply a passerby, or if he had some connection to the darkness that pursued me that night. One thing's for sure, I've learned that some places are best left undisturbed, and some encounters are better left unexplored. The midnight order was supposed to be a routine delivery, but it turned into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. I had been working the late shift at Papa John's during my college years. It was one of those jobs that were supposed to be a temporary stopgap, but the oddities and disquieting events during those nights would leave me forever changed. It was a night like any other when I received the order. The instructions were peculiar: do not knock or ring the bell. Just leave the pizza on the porch, the man on the other end of the line had spoken in a low, clipped tone, as if each word was a burden. He gave me an address in the kind of neighborhood that felt like it was stuck in a time warp, a place where the houses were old and the streetlights flickered like the remnants of forgotten dreams. I drove up to the house, and immediately, an unsettling sensation crawled up my spine. The house itself was an old Victorian, its once grand facade now sagging and sinister in the dim glow of the streetlight. I could see that the curtains were drawn tight, as though the occupants had something or someone to hide. As I pulled into the driveway, the chaos from inside the house was palpable, even through the walls. I could hear loud, erratic noises, a discordant symphony of what sounded like furniture being tossed about. There was a muffled phone ringing, its tone like the desperate cries of an old, forgotten melody. My heart pounded with a primal rhythm, a warning bell of its own. I approached the porch, the night air cold and still, and carefully placed the pizza box on the doormat. The house was eerily quiet for a moment, and then the door creaked open just enough to let a sliver of light escape. The man who answered was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his face partially hidden in the shadows. His movements were jerky, his demeanor unnervingly curt. He reached out to grab the pizza with trembling hands and then, without a word, slammed the door shut. My instincts were on high alert. Something was terribly wrong. I dialed 911, explaining the unsettling noises and the strange behavior of the man. They assured me that a patrol car would be sent over to perform a wellness check. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me like a second skin, but the night seemed to stretch on, each minute heavier with foreboding. When the police arrived and knocked on the door, there was no answer. They left after a cursory glance at the house and a report that all seemed fine. Their indifference only deepened my unease. I had seen something, heard something that they couldn't explain away. The noises, the man's frantic eyes, the oppressive silence that had fallen over the place after the door was closed. None of it made sense. I drove away, but the incident gnawed at me like a relentless itch. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to put the strange delivery behind me. Yet the memory of that night lingered, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. I even drove past the house a few times, hoping for some sign, some indication that everything was normal or at least understandable. Then, one evening, I saw a news report about a missing person, a college student who had vanished without a trace. The name was familiar, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I knew it was just a coincidence, but the fear didn't let up. I thought back to that night, to the frantic noises and the man's hollow gaze. I never did find out what was truly going on in that house, nor did I learn what became of the person who answered the door that night. The unsettling mystery remained, a dark blot on the fabric of my past. Every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees and the night grows still, I think back to that eerie delivery. The house stands as a monument to something unknown, a place where shadows whispered secrets and the door creaked open just enough to let a sliver of darkness escape. And as I lie in bed, I can't help but wonder if the answer to that night's mystery is still waiting there, just beyond the flickering streetlight, waiting for someone to uncover the truth or to become a part of it. Memorial Day was supposed to be a celebration of the freedom and camaraderie we so rarely get to enjoy. We were a close-knit group, and Jacob been generous enough to invite us all for a day on his boat. The sun was blazing, the beers were cold, and the laughter came easily as we drifted over the shimmering surface of the lake, unaware of the shadows creeping in the corners of our day. The party started off with the usual fanfare music blasting from the speakers, food sizzling on the grill, and the occasional splash as someone took a daring dive off the boat. Jacob, our host, had been the life of the party, his infectious energy adding to the day's festive atmosphere. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, it became increasingly clear that Jacob had indulged in more than his share of drinks. The boat rocked gently as we made our way back to the dock, the horizon painted in hues of orange and purple. It was then that I noticed the boat following us. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, maybe another group heading back at the same time. But as we turned, so did the boat, maintaining its position behind us with a persistence that started to gnaw at my nerves. Jacob, his judgment already clouded by the alcohol, glanced back with a frown. "It's probably just the cops," he muttered, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. I couldn't blame him for his worry after all. We were boating under the influence, and the idea of a police chase was less than comforting. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. There was a different kind of tension in the air, an unspoken fear that seemed to settle over us like a thick fog. When we finally reached Jacob's house, the sky had darkened to a deep, unsettling black. The boat behind us had followed us all the way to the dock, and the figures on board had remained hidden in the shadows. As we disembarked and made our way to the front door, a sinking feeling in my gut told me that this was no routine police patrol. The men who had followed us were up to something far more sinister. The door creaked open, and we were met with an eerie silence. The house, usually a warm and welcoming place, now seemed cold and unwelcoming. It wasn't long before we realized that the boat was not the only threat we faced. A loud crash erupted from the back of the house, and before we knew it, the men who had followed us were inside. Their faces were obscured by masks, their voices harsh and commanding. The robbers were relentless. They held us at gunpoint, their eyes cold and calculating as they demanded the combination to Jacob's safe. Panic set in as Jacob, trembling, made a desperate call to his father, relaying the safe's combination with a voice barely above a whisper. The fear in the room was palpable, a heavy blanket that made it hard to breathe. The robbers wasted no time. They tore through the house, ransacking drawers and cabinets, grabbing anything of value. Cash, jewelry, important documents, they took it all. The helplessness we felt as we watched them ransack our lives was almost as suffocating as the fear. They knew exactly what they were after, and it was clear they had been watching us long before we ever noticed them. When the robbers finally left, the silence that followed was almost worse than the chaos we had just endured. We tried to piece together what had happened, but our attempts to contact the authorities were met with a frustrating lack of progress. No conclusive leads emerged, no clues to track down the perpetrators. The police, though sympathetic, were as stumped as we were. In the aftermath, the reality of what we had endured began to sink in. The robbers had targeted us not just by chance, but because they had seen our wealth, our vulnerability. They had used our carefree day against us, turning a day of joy into one of terror. The shadows on the water had been more than a mere trick of the light. They were harbingers of the nightmare that awaited us. We had been betrayed by the very thing that was supposed to be our sanctuary. The boat, once a symbol of relaxation and freedom, had become a vessel of dread. And as we sat in the aftermath, trying to recover from the physical and emotional wounds, we couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of that day were still with us, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That Memorial Day, we learned a harsh lesson in trust and vulnerability. The terror of that night was etched into our minds, a chilling reminder that sometimes the shadows on the water are not just reflections, but warnings of the darkness that lies beneath. It was supposed to be the perfect Memorial Day getaway, a rustic house by the lake in the heart of North Carolina, far removed from the chaos of city life. A place where my friends and I could revel in the simplicity of outdoor games, laughter, and the kind of camaraderie that only comes from sharing stories and drinks around a crackling fire. When we arrived at Lakeview Lodge, our initial impressions were nothing short of idyllic. The house, with its expansive deck overlooking the tranquil water, seemed to embody everything we had hoped for. A hot tub bubbled invitingly in the corner, and a stone fire pit promised warm, smoky evenings. We dove headfirst into our weekend of relaxation, setting up beer pong tables and cornhole boards, firing up the grill, and letting the joy of our little escape envelop us. But the serenity was short-lived. It began with the kind of intrusion that no one expects but everyone dreads: a woman, emerging from the dense woods that bordered the property. Her appearance was as sudden as it was unsettling. She was middle-aged, dressed in what seemed like a ragged coat, her eyes hidden behind large, dark glasses. Her voice, however, was clear and sharp as she berated us for the noise and the litter we had left by the lake. We tried to brush off her hostility, laughing off her complaints as the grumblings of a reclusive neighbor. But her scowl lingered in our minds, casting a shadow over the evening's revelry. Our laughter and music continued, but the uneasy feeling settled in our bones like an unwelcome chill. We tried to shake it off, focusing on the next round of beer pong and the sizzling steaks on the grill. But then, amidst the clamor of our games, a chilling sound sliced through the night, the distant, desperate cry for help. It was strange, disorienting. The cry came from the lake, so faint and distant it almost felt like it was drifting on the wind. Without a second thought, we jumped into the rowboat tethered to the dock, paddling toward the source of the sound, hoping against hope that someone was in trouble and needed our help. As we drifted farther from the shore, the cries grew fainter, more incoherent. Our nerves were on edge, but we pressed on, scanning the water for any sign of distress. Then, in an unsettling twist, we began to hear something else: screams, raw and piercing, coming from the direction of the house. A sudden panic gripped us as we realized what was happening. We turned the boat around in haste, the oars splashing wildly against the water as we raced back. The moon cast eerie shadows on the water, distorting our vision as we approached the dock. Our hearts sank when we reached the shore and saw the house in a state of chaos. Our friends were nowhere to be seen. We rushed inside, the silence broken only by the sound of our own frantic breathing. The living room was a mess: chairs overturned, a broken lamp, and a trail of scattered beer cans. And then, through a window, I saw her, the woman from the woods, standing by the window of a nearby house, staring at us with an unsettling, predatory gaze. Fear surged through me, and I grabbed my phone to call the police. My hands were trembling as I explained the situation: our missing friends, the woman, the strange noises. The police responded quickly, their arrival a small relief in the sea of our mounting terror. We were guided out of the house, away from the property, and instructed to stay in a safe location until they could investigate. The search that followed was a blur of flashing lights and anxious voices. We were kept in a secure location, trying to piece together what had happened. When the police finally returned, their faces were grim. They had found our friends, hidden and terrified, hiding from two masked men wielding axes. The men had disappeared into the night, leaving behind no trace, no hint of their motives. Though our friends were safe, the eerie feeling lingered, a ghostly reminder of the night's horrors. We packed up and left Lakeview Lodge, the memory of that place haunting us like a shadow that refuses to leave. We never learned who the masked men were or what they wanted. The police couldn't find any trace of them, and the woman from the woods vanished as quickly as she had appeared. But the sense of dread that enveloped us that night, the knowledge that something dark and malevolent had lurked so close, left an indelible mark on our souls. Lakeview Lodge was no longer a symbol of escape and freedom, but a place of nightmares, where the boundary between safety and horror had been irrevocably blurred. We left behind not just a house by the lake, but a piece of ourselves, forever altered by the dark presence that had watched and waited in the shadows.